Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first session of this afternoon entitled Debating Gender in Transnational and Transatlantic Settings. It's a very full program. I'm sure you're all as excited as I am to hear these 5 papers. And I will start by introducing Mariselle Meléndez of University of Illinois, who will be speaking about contesting gender in 18th century Spanish American newspapers. Just give me a minute to share your presentation. Okay, that should work. Mariselle, I'm sorry, you can start presenting.
Okay. First, I would like to thank Monica Bolifer for extending me an invitation to such a fascinating conference. It is too bad that I cannot be there with you. Instead, I'm here under below 0 temperatures and another snowstorm. But I would like to also thank everybody that made possible all the logistics of the conference. And I hope you can hear me well. The presentation today, I changed the title a little bit, and I'm gonna talk about gender and education in 18th century Spanish American newspapers. And I will start without further ado. 18th century Spanish newspapers were established under the pursuit of cultural and social reforms centered upon Enlightenment views of religion, politics, science, literature, art, education, economy, and philosophy. Within this frame, women many times became the focal point of discussion and a pretext to discuss the current state of the respective nations. Race, gender, sexuality, and particularly education became some of the most prominent key elements in these discussions, which ultimately appealed to the construction of diverse patriotic epistemologies. The challenge when studying this newspaper is to find publications authored by women. It is interesting to note that if we look at colonial legislation since the 16th century, one cannot find laws banning women from publishing or getting involved in the printing business. As I have discussed elsewhere in the case of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, Mexico, for example, women, particularly widows of printers, were involved in the printing business. For example, their job involved deciding what was worth publishing and subsequently requesting official licenses for their publications. These demonstrate their active role in deciding what publications became available. This proves that women were not disassociated from the dissemination of knowledge in colonial Spanish America. Publications, this demonstrate their active role in deciding what publications became available. This proves that women were not disassociated from the dissemination of knowledge in colonial Spanish America, even if, except for religious writings, and of course, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, publications authored by women were very scarce. It is for this reason that looking at 18th century newspapers, as I'm going to do today, but we can also look at colonial legislation, is a way to find other female voices not yet acknowledged. My presentation today focuses on how the role of women with regard to education was discussed in articles published about women and by women in the Mercurio Peruano, published between 1791-1795, and Papel Periódico de la Ciudad de Santa Fe de Bogotá, which was published between 1791-1797. My critical intervention centers on capturing what male and female contributors have to say about the role of women in their respective viceroyalties. Particular attention, my apologies, is paid to how such gender constructions were in dialogue with European debates at the time about how women ought to be educated. On this topic, Monica Bolufe Peruga reminds us that that in Spain, as in the rest of Europe, quote, reflection over the nature, capabilities, education, and social function of women was ever present in texts of varied content and style. with the aim to propose new models of femininity for a modern and enlightening society, end quote. In the case of Spanish America, debating the role of woman in an enlightening society was also at the heart of many of these newspapers. Although names of contributors were not openly disclosed in many of these news articles, this does not preclude us to observe, understand how fully informed many of these authors were regarding the debates that were taking place at the time about the role of women in society. And I think, see, the prospectus that accompany one of the most successful 18th century newspapers in Peru, the Mercurio Peruano, make clear that newspapers function as discursive platforms par excellence to show the enlightened character of a nation. The major goal of the newspaper was to educate the public about what made Peru such an enlightened nation. For the editors, education encompassed the social manners, poetry, cultural entertainment, the arts, including painting, sculpture, architecture, as well as the sciences. Although the newspaper was mainly geared to educate a male sector of the population, it is important to note that the editors view Peruvian women as important interlocutors of their publications. In the prospectus, the author Jacinto Calero y Moreira made clear that although the stereotypical idea at the time was that women were only inclined to superfluous and trivial matters, frivolidades, the case of the Peruvian woman from Lima was different. According to him, their compatriots, paisanas, have always been interested in issues pertaining to the common good and enlightenment. Todo lo que interesa al bien público y la ilustración común ha merecido siempre a las limeñas una adhesión constante. If we take into consideration that the verb adherir implied in the 18th century seguir su sentencia y opinión, lo que algunas veces se suele hacer con tenacidad, what the author aimed to underline was that these women not only were engaged in such important discussions, but they also were tenacious in offering their opinions. For this reason, Calero y Moreira urged the female sector of the population to take advantage of what the newspaper had to offer. As he added, pliegue a mi fortuna y a la de mi patria que mis amables conciudadanas se valgan de la ocasión del Mercurio para abonar la verdad de mis expresiones y hagan ver que no hay materia, por elevada que sea, que no entre en el sistema de sus meditaciones y aún en su acrisolado criterio. The emphasis on the word patria, conciudadanas, sistema, and criterio underlined the editor's belief that the female sector of the population were also their compatriots, and as such, they were intellectually capable of taking advantage of the enlightened content of the newspaper, and as such, made their own judgments. Important to note is the fact that women were included among the list of subscribers of the newspaper. So it was a fact that they were following the news that the newspaper had to offer. Of equal importance was that the newspaper published articles authored by women. Although some critics tend to believe that, as was the case with newspapers, especially in the 19th century, this type of articles were authored by men who used female pseudonyms, I find quite dangerous to assume that this was always the case, especially when women were indeed among the subscribers of the newspapers. And this applies to the Spanish American newspapers. Financially, the Mercurio Peruano's survival depended on its subscribers, and for that reason, their names were published at the beginning of each volume in an effort to publicly recognize their important commitment to make the newspaper publication a reality. As Bolivar Peruga explained, in the case of Spain and the rest of Europe in the 18th century, women became gradually, quote, an increasing and influential part of an ever-expanding reading audience. This was the case as well in colonial Spanish America. The topic of education served as a recurring theme of debate when talking about women in the newspaper, and one of the discursive themes through which women's role in society was discussed and debated or contested. One of the most common arguments that appeared in the newspaper was the idea that in Peru, women were challenging how education was to take place in the domestic space, especially when it came to linguistic norms. For example, in a letter published under the section Educación, entitled Carta escrita a la sociedad sobre el abuso de que los hijos tuteen a sus padres, the father of 4 children complained that after a 7-month hiatus from the house, because he had to take a business trip to Cusco, upon his return, he noticed how his children were addressing him in the informal use of tú. After consulting with his male friends, he realized that this linguistic practice was common in Lima and fully endorsed by mothers, grandmothers, and aunts. In fact, he recounted a confrontation he had with his mother-in-law when she yelled at him after he scolded his youngest daughter because the child addressed her aunt in the tú form. When the father proceeded to yell at the girl, the mother-in-law intervened and insulted him for being an abusive father for yelling at something so insignificant. In fact, she called him a tyrant and proceeded to tell him that usted quiere enseñar a otros la buena crianza. Debe saber primero que es mucho atrevimiento el querer corregir una costumbre general. Y aunque no lo fuera, es mi voluntad y basta para que sus hijos tuteen a quien les dé la gana. What this confrontation underscored was the fact that women were contesting the extent to which formal Spanish education was interfering in local linguistic matters and specifically in the domestic space, which had always been part of women's domain. This female protagonist's reaction made clear that local customs could certainly transform traditional education norms and should be taken into consideration when talking about matters of education in any household in Lima. Education within the domestic space was at the hands of women, and for this reason, the mother-in-law argued that this was a domain in which women exercised power through their own local experiences and perspectives. Her stance aligned with Spanish 18th century circulating ideas based on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and here I follow Catherine Jaffe's words, that women had a unique role as mothers within the private sphere of the family, and as such had the right to determine their own rules. What this female character argued was that education embraced more than what was learned on books and also extended to to everyday interactions. In February 1791, the editors of the newspaper followed up this conversation with a letter entitled Carta escrita a la sociedad sobre los gastos excesivos de una tapada, accompanied also with a message encouraging those illustrious women from Lima to submit letters defending women from the accusations they received from male contributors about their propensity towards vanity, luxury, consumption, and inefficiencies in their domestic roles of educating their children. The invitation read, la sociedad se admira de ver que todas las tres cartas de doctrina doméstica sean de hombres quejosos y saca por consecuencia que las madamas son o más felices o más pacientes. De todos modos, deseáramos que alguna señorita de las muchas ilustradas y filósofas que abunda esta capital nos honrase con alguna carta o disertación justificativa de los supuestos defectos de su amable sexo y descubridora de los verdaderos del nuestro. The aforementioned letter received a strong response from one woman who signed with the pseudonym of Antispasia. This name derives from the Greek word antispasy, which I had explained in another essay. It meant to draw in the opposite direction. The woman was inviting the editors to look at the other side of the equation. What is interesting about this letter is that it began denouncing the editors for not doing enough about on publishing articles about women's capabilities to contribute to important discussions. The female author added that the male editors had published only 3 letters that overtly criticized women for their ineptitude in educating their children and for their excessive passion for luxury clothing. This is a topic that I discuss in that other essay. The female contributor stated, señores míos, después de haber lavado la cara a todas mis paisanas y haberlas enamorado con las dulces clausalillas de su prospecto, Luego han descubierto su poca consecuencia, publicando 3 cartas en contra de los modales y costumbres más autorizadas de nuestro sexo y país. The female author found hypocritical that the intention to include and praise women had instead turned into an opportunity to only criticize them. It was for this reason that Antispasia stated that she agreed with old and ugly women when they say that men's words were always guided by false praises and deceit. Lisonjas, falsedades y engaños. What the letter was pleading was for the male editor's commitment to offer women a public forum from which they could address their interests and concerns. In a later issue, the editors addressed the female readers by inviting them to take advantage of the opportunities available in the capital city to enlighten themselves. In an article published in May 1791, entitled Nuevos Establecimientos del Buen Gusto, the editor stated that one of the places que se dirigen a la ilustración was the Escuela de Diseño, established by a member of the Royal Academy of Seville and professor of drawing and painting, Don José del Pozo. They describe both arts as useful and enjoyable, un estudio tan útil y ameno. They inform that those women who were interested in pursuing these fine arts should notify the professor directly, as he will be glad to offer courses for women between 4 and 6 p.m. The costs were 8 pesos a month. They believed, so of course this was geared to women of upper class. They believed many women in Lima would be interested in pursuing this lesson. Another activity that the editors mentioned that was available to both women and men for 3 pesos a month was French dancing, taught in an academy opened by an Italian instructor named Vicente Bertarini. The editors noted that lessons of local and foreign dances were already extremely popular in Lima, as the classes offered by Black instructors were well attended. Ya logra una concurrencia numerosa y como por otra parte los negros que hasta aquí han sido y son los maestros de danza, tienen bastante números de discípulos y discípulas. Dance was seen as an activity that nurtured mind and body and allowed women to acquire buen gusto, while also contributing to felicidad pública. But how did women respond to what these reformers had to say regarding the education of women and their role in society, or buen gusto? In April 1794, the newspaper included a poem written by a woman. The poem was entitled Carácter de cierta señorita ilustre, pintado por ella misma en las siguientes segadillas inéditas. It is important to note that the focus of the poem was on the female author herself, as she thought to describe her character and temperament as an educated woman. The only information given about the author was that she was an educated woman. There was no hint if the woman was a subscriber or just a woman who accessed the newspaper through other means. It was very popular with this particular newspaper. The poem begins stating how she wanted to be seen as a woman. El que me amare sepa que tal mi genio, que quiero que me estime hasta el desprecio. The woman is referring to her genio, temperament, which implied at the time having the inclination, taste, disposition, and interior capacity towards something. The woman used the poem as a discursive vehicle to demand to be estimated to the highest level, even if that carried disdain in others. Immediately, she made clear that others must value her as she thought she deserved. Respect and admiration were to be concomitant to any act of love she received from others. She also promised no mercy to any lover who was not willing to respect her wishes. Amante que rendido mi enojo sienta, no espere el que me ablande, porque él padezca. Furthermore, she warned that no lover should expect continuous praising from her, as she preferred to stay away from recurrent acts of attention. El que alguna fineza de mí consiga, no ha de esperar por eso que la repita. She underlined that she owed nothing to any man, and they should not have any false expectations when it came to her. The poem continued by emphasizing her exceptionality as a woman as she portrayed herself as outside the norm. She made clear that she only cared for herself and was not to be bothered by what others thought or expected from her. To this regard, she stated, el amante que en dudas más se anegare no pretenda entenderme porque no es fácil, que soy tan rara que han dado en divertirme de ver qué rabia. To be considered rara at the time implying to be extraordinary, very uncommon, as well as insigne, sobresaliente o excelente en su línea. What the female voice wanted to underline was that she was indeed extraordinary and did not fit the mold of prototypical woman, as she demanded to be recognized as an illustrious woman due to her knowledge, attitude, and respect. She made clear that her goal in life was not to seek love, because love was always blind and blindness was in itself dangerous. Yo no entiendo de amores que amor es ciego y el que ciego se expone a mil tropiezos. However, she acknowledged that despite having admirers, there were nevertheless people that were willing to accept her as she was. In fact, she concluded the poem stating, aquí este es mi carácter, estas mis mañas, con lo que el que me compre sabrá mis tachas y verá claro que en entrando advertido no era engañado. She acknowledged that her character was to be labeled as one with faults. However, she refused to succumb to the traditional female model and preferred to preserve her free will. She seemed to emphasize that for women to demand respect, she needed to value herself first. To be valued meant to reject any compromises and to abide by her own rules, which in this case implied to be respected by her intellectual capacity and to be recognized as an educated woman. It is important to note that in the last issues published in the Mercurio Peruano, when it was clear that the publication was going to come to an end due to the lack of revenue to cover the cost of production, the editor published an article indicated the impact that the newspaper was having on Peruvian society. To this respect, the article said, amor patriótico, ilustración pública, fomento a la literatura, se hicieron unas palabras de moda que no faltaban ya hasta de las bocas de las mujeres y de los mulatos palanganas. It is interesting to note that in this quote, men were grouped with a racial group that has always been marginalized in colonial society, mulattoes. The editor implied that women who traditionally were kept away from the realm of enlightening discussion as active agents, now, thanks to the newspaper, were able to engage in discussions about patriotic love, public enlightenment, and love for literature, which had been usually reserved to male citizens. If we take into consideration that literature at the time referred to el conocimiento y ciencia de las letras, the article acknowledged that women in the Viceroyalty of Peru were interested and versed in many matters, including arts, erudition. Thanks to the circulation of the newspaper, the Mercurio Peruano in this sense served as a public platform to educate its citizens, including women, and for women to participate in such discussions. Now, if we go to the Papel Periódico de Santa Fe de Bogotá.
Mariselle, I will need to interrupt you here. You still have some 5 minutes left. Sorry.
I can't hear you.
Mic is on. You still have some 5 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So we are, okay. I'm not going to be able then to discuss, it's already 25 minutes? Oh, gosh. Okay, I'm not going to be able to discuss the Papel Periódico de Santa Fe de Bogotá, but I will be glad to do this in the discussion. But here we have, again, the same kind of news, but with regard to education in the domestic space, there's some contentions between female contributors epitomized in the voice of a wiser old woman and a younger woman with regard to what marriage meant in the context of educating the future children. So I won't be able to talk about those specific cases, so I will go straight to my concluding remarks. Pilar Gonzalo Aispuro accurately states that in the case of colonial Spanish America, la época de las reformas borbónicas fue un periodo en que los cambios económicos y políticos anunciaron la proximidad de una transformación en la educación y en el papel de la mujer en la sociedad, although marginalization of women was still rampant. Education was a topic that gave women at the time, a voice to express their views on the nature of it and how to acquire it. It was a discussion that continued throughout the 19th century, as we could witness in the well-known essay published in 1823 in Mexico and written by Ana Josefa Caballero de la Borda, entitled Necesidad de un establecimiento de educación para las jóvenes mexicanas. Caballero de la Borda still criticized the insufficient education women were receiving and that were keeping them in the bárbara ignorancia and turning them into a type of pests, animales dañinos, that made no contribution to the nation. She argued, as it was popular at the time, that even in the role of a mother, it was important for a woman to be educated to better contribute to the formation of her children and therefore society. According to her, a big mistake made by authorities was to circumscribe women as heads of the household who could only educate their children. This type of education, she added, fell short of forming virtuous citizens, ciudadanos virtuosos, who lacked knowledge in the sciences and were able to develop love for their homeland. In a recent essay, Elizabeth Franken-Lewis argues that in the 18th century, Spain and Spanish America, quote, the woman who hosted tertulias, the woman who subscribed and contributed the letters and poems to newspapers, the woman whose paintings were shown in public exhibits in the art academies, the woman who delivered official speeches, the young woman whose intellect was put in public display, and the woman who published their own original texts, as well as those who chose foreign texts to translate and publish, also exercised to varying degrees the public use of the reason, end quote. The articles I discussed in the larger part of the essay are prime examples of how in the late colonial Spanish America, discussions pertaining to women's role in society and their role in educating future citizens, as well as themselves, were part of a lengthy and sometimes contradictory discussions in which gender roles were denounced, contested, and reformulated again and again. Male and female voices engaged in redefining the role of woman in domestic and public spaces that, despite its locus of initiation, was also deeply concerned to the debates taking place simultaneously at the other side of the Atlantic. Thank you.